Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Professor Charles Weaver, who serves on the faculty at Juilliard School of Music and CUNY. He is also a parish music director at St. Mary's in Norwalk, where he directs the professional Schola Cantorum, as well as the student Schola of Regina Pacis Academy. We discuss historical performance practice issues surrounding the singing of Renaissance polyphony, with an eye to helping parish music directors implement techniques which improve their choir's singing of classical polyphony. Professor Weaver will cover these topics in an in-depth way this summer in an evening class which runs from 6 to 8:30, July 25th through the 29th, 2022 at St. Joseph's Seminary. If you find today's interview helpful, I recommend looking at attending his class either in person or online. To learn more about this course or the other 8 courses we're offering this summer, please visit www.dunwoodie.edu, spelled DUNWOODIE.edu, and click on Dunwoodie Music. And now, on to the interview. Thanks so much for joining me today, Charlie. You are our only guest to have appeared 3 times now on the podcast, and I'm always happy to have you back.
I'm always happy to be here.
So, before we discuss historical performance practice, and that's our topic for today, and how it can be implemented in a parish choir, it might be helpful to discuss what historical performance practice is more generally. Certainly, this is a big philosophical question with which musicians have grappled intensively, especially over the last 50 to 60 years. If you had to give a definition for it, what would it be? And what are the philosophical assumptions that you're bringing to that definition?
The big idea is that when you are approaching music of earlier periods, and especially the need for this increases the further back you go, that when you approach that music, you're not dealing with a living tradition of performance. For instance, the music of the Middle Ages or the music of the Renaissance, there's no unbroken tradition handed down from teacher to student that tells you how to sing or play this music. So that when you encounter those things, you have to draw on 2 main historical sources. One of them is recapturing the design of instruments that were used at the time. So this is the idea of using period instruments. For instance, either playing on old instruments themselves or on instruments that are modeled to be faithful reproductions of those instruments. So with a violin, for instance, there have been changes over the centuries in the way the neck attaches to the body, in how long the neck is, in how long the bow is, and how the bow is put together. And the idea is that if you play on a bow in the style of an 18th century bow and a violin in the style of an 18th century violin, that this will give you insight about how the music should be performed. The other main source is theoretical treatises. So this would be reading instruction booklets from the time roughly contemporaneous to the music that you want to play or sing, and gleaning from those sources information about how the music should go, how fast it should be, how you should think about its delivery, all those sorts of things. So it's basically an idea about performing based not on a living tradition of performing handed down from teacher to pupil, but rather based on historical sources.
Right. So talk about this a little bit more philosophically. When you are doing this, are you trying to recreate what they did in the past, or simply to hear other possibilities in how something might be performed that you wouldn't ordinarily think of if you didn't go through that process of reading or discovering those 2 sources?
When the movement began early in the 20th century and sort of reaching its maybe heyday in the mid 20th century, the practitioners of historical performance really did use the language of authenticity or recreating the music as it would have been heard at the time of those composers. So, there were famous quips like, you play Bach your way, I'll play Bach his way, and this sort of thing.
Not pretentious at all.
In more recent decades, especially thanks to the work of Richard Turuskin, this idea has really come under intense scrutiny and criticism. So that I would say nowadays, most people don't use the language of recreation, but rather more one of gaining insight for the present. And, that philosophically speaking, at a certain point, it stops becoming more authentic. It's really not a historical thing at all. It's more of a modern thing, right? So modern performances of Baroque music, even on modern instruments, have become considerably faster in recent decades. The example I like to think of is the old Otto von Klemperer St. Matthew Passion, which I have on 3 CDs, whereas nowadays, any recording of that piece would fit easily onto 2 CDs. So, I mean, that tells you something about the way tempo has changed in the last 50 years. And is that a function of historical correctness? Well, maybe in part, but it's difficult to say that. It's really more about kind of a modern approach using these, really honestly as a reaction to kind of the 19th century and following tradition of performance.
Right.
So it's style changes all the time in musical performance, and historical performance is really just one part of that.
Right. And of course, you can talk about this in all sorts of areas of music. And this is a discussion for another time, this applying to chant. Today, we're focusing on polyphony. But of course, in your work at Juilliard, you actually are usually in a different genre as well, or a different time frame. So could you tell us a little bit more about your work in the historical performance practice department at Juilliard and what sort of time frame you're largely dealing with there?
Sure. So the department was started about a dozen years ago, and the idea is that it focuses on Baroque music, so music of the 17th and especially the 18th centuries. But there have been forays into music both earlier and later. So a few projects involving early 17th century music or even 16th century music, and a few projects going into the 19th century. And the orientation of the department is very much towards orchestral instruments. So one big part of what we do at Juilliard is to field a Baroque orchestra of students, and they work with guest artists and conductors and put on concerts. So most or all of my students really are violinists, cellists, wind players, keyboard players, and the real orientation in the program is towards playing instrumental ensemble music of the 18th century.
So what are some things that you talk about in a typical lesson with a student about phrasing, perhaps? Bowing is obviously a little far afield from where we are today, but what about phrasing?
Well, one main way that we approach this that might be different from a quote unquote modern tradition is that we use the language and the terminology of rhetoric to describe how we approach things. So we want the music not just to sing, but we want the music to speak. And this is true in vocal music, obviously, but even more so in instrumental music, where you use these 18th century ideas of communication, music as a language, music as a way of moving the passions and the affect of the listener. And we think about phrasing in those terms rather than in a hyper emphasis on legato or on cantabile style, let's say. So that is a frequent subject in lessons. In the class that I teach at Juilliard, which is a class on historical theory, much of what I talk about is actually older ideas. So one goal that I have with my students is to give them a grounding in what an 18th century music education would look like. I want them to come out of our program with some awareness of the training that a professional musician would have experienced in Europe in the early 18th century. And that is largely based on much older ideas. So in the early 18th century, the best musicians in Europe were trained in Naples at the Naples Conservatory. And the training involved intensive study of plain chant and modes from an early age, say 7 or 8. And the children would study solfege using the old hexachord system for 3 years before they were even allowed to touch an instrument. There was a saying at the Naples Conservatory, if you can't sing, you'll never play. So, I mean, think about how different that is from a kind of modern approach to children's pedagogy, where
Suzuki
often
or
kids,
something.
kids start with their instruments at a very young age. And the idea is that if you don't start by 5, you'll never amount to anything on the piano or on the violin. And it's very different from the 18th century approach, which was much more based on singing, and especially singing first and foremost plain chant.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So here's a bridge with the earlier time frame that we're going to, and focusing, especially on classical or Renaissance polyphony. And you were talking about rhetoric as the principle behind phrasing in the Baroque period. But what would you say is the principle behind phrasing in the Renaissance period and classical era polyphony, Palestrina and such?
It really is rhetoric there too. And in fact, the earliest use of rhetoric in relation to music arose in discussions of classical polyphony. So there was a whole branch of music theory in the 16th century called Musica Poetica, which was about the way that a composer puts music together in order to create pieces. And one part of that was these sort of rhetorical divisions of the work and rhetorical figures. And famously, there was a writer named Joachim Burmeister who applied with great specificity ideas of classical rhetoric and particular figures to things that happened in the music of Lassus. And he uses a Lassus motet as the basis for his discussion. And, he divides the motet into 9 periods, 9 phrases, let's say, and that each one of those uses these different rhetorical devices. So that is very much the basis of a historical discussion of phrase and form in classical polyphony.
All right, so let's get into the weeds. There are a number of different areas we could dive into, and you'll be covering these in a more in-depth way in your class at St. Joseph's Seminary this summer, but let's scratch the surface on a few of them, and starting with what you were just talking about. So in terms of rhetoric driving a polyphonic phrase, when people think of Palestrina, they think of the sound of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, where it's a sort of eternal peace, a smoothness of sound. That's I would say a largely shared modern conception of that music. And how does that interact with this idea of rhetoric? Because people don't speak in a smooth way in that same way when you're thinking about it now. So what does that mean in terms of articulation in a phrase?
Well, it has to be driven by the words first and foremost. And I mean, that's true of all vocal music, but it's particularly true, I think, of Renaissance polyphony. The idea that it's just this kind of faceless wall of sound, I mean, certainly there is a sensual appeal to just hearing the counterpoint of a composer like Palestrina. It's just wonderful. And it ties in, as you mentioned, with the sort of the Baroque spaces in which we might encounter this music. But there is also an element of attention to the words that we should not neglect, right? So it's very important to study the meaning of the words, the proper pronunciation of the words, and so forth. But it's maybe difficult to even get started or get to that point with the music because it's so different from kind of what you might encounter in other genres.
And there's sometimes, just if you're thinking about a parish choir, a lack of awareness even of Latin accentuation patterns, hopefully, build those in through habit. But, when we're talking about a language that is not in use anymore, I'm just thinking about, you compare talking about word accent in a Palestrina motet to something in Howells or something that's in English. You can have a different level of awareness that you have to cultivate with a parish choir, right?
Absolutely. I mean, ideally everyone would study Latin for several years before before taking up the study of music, but I know that's not really
Alas.
possible in most situations.
So let's head on to another area, and this is the thorny issue of voicing and ranges. And let's stay with Palestrina here. And could you describe who would have been his singers and what would their ranges have been? And then naturally we'll flow into the question about how do we do this music in SATB parish choirs today, and where do we pitch this stuff?
It's such an important question. So the question of range, it can be misleading because the names of the voices sound like the names of modern voice types, but they are not necessarily the same thing. So your typical 16th century polyphony has a range of 21 notes. In a few cases, in English music in particular, that range is extended. And then there are also pieces that are for smaller ranges, like 15 notes. And when I say 15 notes, I mean literally 2 octaves between the lowest note sung by the lowest part and the highest note sung by the highest part. And the normal range, let's say, of those 21 notes is usually, let's say, from the G at the bottom of the bass staff to the E in the top space of the treble staff. And this is divided more or less equally between 4 voice types: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Now, one way to think about it is that each voice type has roughly an octave range that they sing in. So the bass would go from G to G, the tenor would go from C to C, the alto would go from G to G, and then the soprano would cover kind of the top octave, let's say. And the interesting thing that comes out of this is that that's quite different from the ranges that we expect with modern singers. So a modern bass singer often sings above the bass staff, and a modern soprano often sings well above the treble staff. And a modern alto is usually a female voice, or very often a female voice. And this is where you run into the problem of attempting old music with these assumptions that the names are the same in the 16th century as they are today. So a female alto is going to struggle to sing an alto part at the pitch at which it was written in the 16th century. So in most cases, especially if you look at older editions of Renaissance polyphony, the solution is to transpose the music up. That's why all those old scores of Palestrina classics like Sicut Cervus are in the key of A flat major or the key of A major, which, essentially were never notated as such in the 16th century. But it's done to accommodate female altos. And then the problem that arises is that all the other voices are also higher than it seems they should be, which possibly also ties back in with the rhetoric thing, because it's much easier to enunciate and to sing words clearly in a lower range. As soon as a soprano is up above the treble staff, good luck with diction. It usually is the first thing to go, rightly so, as a result of kind of
vowel modification,
compromising on vocal technique, right?
Yeah.
So the main thing I would counsel is that when singing Renaissance polyphony, I think it's better to start at the written pitch, which is generally going to be lower than what you might expect. And probably all of the females in a parish choir are going to be on the soprano part. And then you run into issues of, well, what if you have an unbalance between female and male voices? Maybe you don't have enough men to cover all of the lower parts. And then
right. You're really stretching us now, because so many parish choirs are used to SAB, right? And now you're talking about three parts being covered by the men. Yeah.
Yep. And it's just an unfortunate fact of the thing. But, doing it this way really changes the sound, because it stops being when it's lower, you hear the words better, and it becomes kind of more oriented towards the lower voices in a way. And, then you don't have any of your ladies in your choir singing low F or low E or low D, as sometimes happens,
Yeah. As an alto invested in this question, can I ask, so obviously we would have had boy sopranos in a choir for Palestrina, but what about the alto part? Was it castrati? Was it just men who could sing high, or was it like the older boys still transitioning? Could you address that?
The castrati actually arose just a bit later, so overlapping with the end of Palestrina's career. But for instance, the Sistine Chapel choir 100 years before that, the time of Josquin, was actually all adult men, and so the soprano part would be falsettists and so forth. So certainly, boys could sing, but even your average soprano part in the 16th century is within the range of an adult male falsettist.
Mm-hmm. A question that expands out from this: could you address, obviously the stratification that you're talking about, very clearly defined ranges between the voices, is a Renaissance development, right? And that's one of the things that makes, for example, singing late medieval polyphony or early Renaissance stuff, where the ranges are a little bit more, you just have what we call voice crossings now all over. That makes it a little bit more thorny in terms of helping, an average parish choir hear that stuff.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because I think we have to be really careful thinking about this idea of voice stratification. There's a dialogue from the 16th century where the interlocutors are singing madrigals, and they just hand out the books and sort of decide off the cuff which part they're going to take: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And I think there was maybe somewhat less specialization than there is now, and more of a willingness to sort of just take on a part rather than to identify as only a bass or only a tenor. It's a little difficult to know that, but you're certainly right that medieval music essentially has no bass part most of the time. So a composer like Dufay, which really is, if Renaissance polyphony is outside of the kind of normal ranges of a modern parish choir, something like the late medieval music of Machaut or Dufay is maybe even more so, because there it's really all the parts are essentially tenor parts.
You thought your voicing problem was bad in your parish choir. Now try that stuff.
Right.
So, could you talk about then after Palestrina, what happens with it? You've got these stratified voice parts, but it seems like their ranges expand dramatically in other subsequent eras.
Yeah, well, I mean, a female soprano can certainly sing much higher than a male soprano, or for that matter, a castrato, which was that occupied the soprano parts of the papal chapel and other choral establishments in the 17th century. A castrato could sing much higher than a falsettist. So you do get these sort of higher soprano parts. And that alto voice, that kind of Renaissance alto voice, which nowadays we might think of as a high tenor, became a specialized version of a tenor rather than being thought of as purely an alto. So, for instance, the voice type in French Baroque opera that's referred to as the haut contre, or the high countertenor, is essentially a very high tenor who's comfortable singing A or B or maybe even high C in a kind of light way. And it's a little different from the Renaissance idea. So certainly the ranges expand greatly over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, leading to our kind of modern division into the 4 modern voice types.
Right. So here's a related question, and we touched on this in a previous episode with you, but could you again explain what chiavetti is and how this knowledge should help a parish music director who's doing something like figuring out which edition of a piece to hand to his choir?
Yep. It's something that we should just touch on again and again because it's such an important issue. So I said that the range of a typical vocal piece was 21 notes. Much of the time, that range is shown, as I described, as being from roughly G at the bottom of the bass staff to E at the top of the treble staff. But some large percentage of polyphony is notated in a higher range. So the lowest note of the bass part in these pieces would be the C, kind of in the middle of the bass staff. And the highest note in the soprano part would be, say, high A, well above the treble staff. And to accommodate this higher range, the music was written in a different set of clefs. So you would have a G clef for the top part, and then the C clefs for the lower 3 parts. Whereas in the kind of lower version of music, what are called the natural clefs, you have C clefs for the soprano, alto, and tenor parts, and then an F clef for the bass part. So the question naturally arises when you look at these 2 ranges is, were these different people? And the clear answer from rather unambiguous and copious evidence with treatises and with instrumental transcriptions and so on is that the music in the higher clefs, or the chiavette as they're called, was pretty much always transposed down roughly a fourth to match the range of the lower parts. So it's frequent when you encounter pieces in the higher clefs, they look like they might work for your modern choir with female altos and so on. But really it's pretty anachronistic probably to try to just sing them at the pitch they're written in. Instead, they're more likely supposed to be down a fourth, and then they look more like they're in the range of all the other music that we've been discussing.
Right. What is your experience? The average choral director has various editions available to them. A lot of people are using CPDL. What's the average edition's knowledge of chiavetti and these high clefs and transposition levels? Is it?
Yeah.
What are you noticing in trends on CPDL?
It's so funny that CPDL, I think, is way ahead of the curve on this. So there are certain editors that I trust on CPDL. You encounter them and you think, great, this is, this person is a good editor.
Can you name some?
Yeah, sure. Pothar and Imre springs to mind. Nancho Alvarez, who's, done massive amount of work on Victoria and Morales and Guerrero. And, those people get the issue with clefs, and often even if they don't transpose in the edition, they'll post either the Lily Pond file or the finale file that they use to engrave the score, and it's an easy matter to transpose it yourself.
Presuming you know Lily Pond, which is an enigma to me. Just kidding. Yes, that's a totally separate subject.
Yes, another day we'll do the Lily Pond episode. But you're much more likely to encounter a transposed down according to the correct reading of the clefs score on CPDL than you are in a music library, because the philosophy behind most scholarly editions is to produce what's known as a diplomatic facsimile, right? You want to reproduce the exact notation in a form that is accessible for the modern scholar. So typically they don't transpose, which means that their editions of things in the high clefs from a scholarly edition are more or less useless unless your choir is comfortable reading down a fourth.
Right. Always a challenging transposition interval, indeed.
Oh, it's horrible.
So let's move on to something else, and it is the elephant in the room about the early music sound. And by this, I mean the use of vibrato in singing. What does the evidence suggest from the Renaissance period about its use in singing?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to approach this, but one favorite of mine is if you look at historical organs from the Renaissance or from the early 17th century that have a stop called the vox humana. That stop is characterized first and foremost by its vibrating, tremulando sort of sound. So clearly, vibrato was associated to some degree with the human voice from a very early period. Its usage has gone up and down in popularity over time. Oddly enough, the 19th century seems to be one of the most anti-vibrato periods in the history of vocal performance. And, we can listen, for instance, to some of Verdi's favorite singers. So one of Verdi's favorite sopranos was Adelina Patti, and you can find recordings of her that she made in her 70s in the early 20th century with wax cylinder recording technology. And she sings with basically no vibrato.
Wow.
Likewise, Wagner in the score of Siegfried notates where he wants the tenor Siegfried to add vibrato, and it's only in a few spots. So, this idea that Verdian and Wagnerian performance should involve a heavy use of vibrato is actually a 20th century innovation.
That's so interesting. So do you think that's because, in the Baroque period, vibrato really is seen as an ornament, and that transfers in through the classical into the Romantic eras?
Sure. So I think, especially with string playing, for instance, vibrato is certainly described as an ornament because perhaps vibrato when you're singing is somewhat natural, right? A healthy vocal technique in an adult generally can, but not always, involves a certain amount of vibrato. Not necessarily to the point of being a fault that causes bad tuning, but, singing with support with the adult mechanism often gives rise to a certain natural amount of vibrato. It's not natural on the violin, right? You don't walk around with your left hand shaking all the time just as a natural function of performance, right? This is something that has to be cultivated in imitation of the voice. And really with string vibrato, it seems like it arose in the 20th century as a response to technological changes. So namely, the use of metal strings, which were introduced after the First World War, and which have a much brighter and piercing sound that can be somewhat softened by the vibrato, and also the use of recording. So this is my theory for why vocal vibrato became more popular in the 20th century, because opera singers before the advent of recording, you would listen to them only when you saw them, and they could emote using their acting and facial gestures and so on. And on a recording, when you don't see the singer live, the only way they can really create that heavy, tense amount of emotion that we associate with opera is to add vibrato, which it's very striking to the ear. So I think a lot of the history of vibrato is intersects with the history of recording technology and so forth. But a lot of our kind of idea of the Renaissance aesthetic is based on that English choral sound, right? I admire very much the King's College Choir, and even early music groups from England like Stile Antico or the Tallis Scholars, and they're the sopranos with voices that I think consciously imitate to some degree the mechanism of a boy's voice. And so, right. They sing with maybe less vibrato than certainly, an Italian choir would. And so we associate that with the old aesthetic, but I think maybe we're reading too much into it. A certain amount of vibrato is natural and healthy and probably unavoidable.
So what you're saying now is probably going to upset a lot of people who work really hard at cultivating a straight tone and convincing others that they can sing in a healthy way in that straight tone.
I think they probably can. And I mean, the human voice is such an amazing thing that can do all manner of things. It's, vibrato and straight tone is just the beginning of it. I mean, just listen to traditions of throat singing from around the world. I mean, it's a thing we can do that has a remarkably wide range of possibilities. So certainly, cultivating a straight tone is a wonderful thing, and it's great to be flexible. But whether there's a historical argument for straight tone over the use of vibrato, I think is probably questionable.
Okay, so now if you're gonna give that latitude, what are some things that you would say in a choir of amateur voices about cultivating a healthy technical approach to singing straight tone?
I think if you're going to sing straight tone, you need to find a way to do it that is not using pressure or, metaphors of squeezing or this sort of thing to achieve that sound, right? And it's interesting that we tend to overlook vibrato in the lower voices and then really focus on the sopranos, which is, I think, a little unfair in terms of the straight tone thing. But it's fine to look for that or to look for focus in the sound, especially if it can improve things like tuning or ensemble or blend. But it has to be done in a way that is not unhealthy. So it has to be done on the breath with support and not in a way that forces or strains the voice in any way.
Yeah, there's a gentleness there in the onset.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So let's dive into a little bit now about tuning. You were just mentioning the relationship of vibrato to tuning, but our ears and the ears of the average parish chorister are really accustomed to equal temperament. And so how do you help cultivate the hearing of thirds in a more pure tuning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a certain amount of education in what the issues are is worthwhile. So I will certainly cover this in my class, and I covered in my classes at Juilliard. This was a huge deal for writers about music, not only in the 16th century, but going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and really up until the 20th century, when equal temperament more or less became the standard. But even in the 20th century, you get discussions of pure tuning. So it's worth realizing that equal temperament, or the tuning system that we use on the piano, is a compromise in that we can maybe aim for something to be more in tune. In terms of learning to hear pure intervals, there's actually an app for that I recommend to my students. I don't know what it's called now, but it used to be called the Harmonize app. And essentially, you can download it on your smartphone, and it'll play two pitches, and you can slide your finger on the screen of the phone up and down to move one of the pitches until you think it's in tune, and then you submit it, and it tells you how close you are to a pure interval. So
that sounds really fun.
It's a wonderful tool for playing around with. Yeah, it seems to be called the Harmonize app. So maybe we can link to that in the show notes.
That sounds great. Would you ever address that in a physiological sense, that there's a way in more pure versions of the intervals that you can become more sensitive to physiologically sensing those tuning issues?
Because when you sing a pure interval in an ensemble, you start to hear the overtones that arise, when two or more parts are in tune. One thing I use, even with my non-vocal students, but my instrumental students at Juilliard, is we listen to really good barbershop quartet singing, because there is a tradition from the 20th century where pure tuning is the goal. And hearing an ensemble like that making those sounds, and you can really hear the overtones popping out when it's well done. That becomes a thing that a choir could strive for.
Right. Let's move to another topic. and that is tempo. Could you explain to us the Renaissance sense of tactus?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, misunderstanding about this because didn't write their music, they didn't write their vocal music with bar lines. So we often think, oh, it doesn't have bar lines, it's meant to be sort of more free or flexible. But it doesn't need bar lines because it has tactus. Tactus is more or less equivalent to what we would call the beat. But one issue with sort of a modern approaching as a modern performer this old music is that the note that gets the beat is the semibreve, or what we call the whole note. And that's very different from kind of the way we teach elementary music now, where the quarter note gets the beat and the whole note is a really long note of 4 beats. It's good to read from editions where you're just recreating the original time values. Certainly older editions tended to reduce them. So if something was written as a whole note in the original music, an older edition might write it as a half note or even as a quarter note to reflect this idea that the whole note gets the beat and the quarter note gets the beat in a modern sense. Nowadays, and this is certainly true on CPDL, many editions favor keeping the old time values. As we approach this as with our parish choirs, we have to accustom them to the idea that the whole note goes by pretty quickly.
Right. And even getting them on that page with the half note is sometimes a real challenge.
Yep. It's that's why we do what we do. Right?
So could you address a little bit about the ways in which different sections in Renaissance polyphony, switching between duple and triple, would have related to each other? In other words, what's constant, if there is a constant? And if there is a constant, is it the meter or the subdivision of the meter?
Yeah, this is certainly a can of worms from the scholarly perspective. I'll put it this way. When it happens simultaneously, there are very clear rules for how it works. So for instance, if you are singing a 4-voice piece and 2 of the voices go into a triple meter and the other 2 stay in a duple meter, it is very clear that there is a 3-to-2 relationship between them. In other words, it's the bar that stays the same, let's say.
Can you give us some examples of repertoire here? Are you going back all the way to like something like the Missa Prolationem?
Yeah, interestingly, that's kind of a counterexample, because the mensurations there all have basically the beat is equivalent and the bars are different sizes. In some pieces, you do get maybe one part goes into a proportion, usually like a 3-to-2 sort of thing. And it's very clear from the context that the bar stays the same and the beats change.
Another sort of can of worms in rhythm is the general challenge that parish choirs have in singing contrapuntal and imitative styles of polyphony. So what are some helpful techniques that have been used in the past for achieving accuracy in singing rhythmically?
One approach is to have everyone tap the tactus together. So rather than saying that one person, the conductor, is in charge of how the rhythm is going to be delivered, everyone internalizes the beat, let's say, feeling it either by tapping the foot or tapping a hand or even just waving arms up and down can be helpful.
Okay, so you're talking about the relationship between conducting and the embodiment of the music in the singers itself. What would you say are some helpful things that we can think about from historical practice when it comes to conducting, both to make our conducting really communicative, but also to help singers embody the rhythm and things like word accent and the phrase shape and structure and those sorts of things?
I would say the most important thing is that Renaissance music, probably 90% of the time, should be in 2 rather than in 4. Speaking as a conductor who works with a lot of amateur musicians, when we beat time in 4, we feel like we have a lot more control over things. But actually, this is, I believe, a false economy. It's better to train your choir to feel the music in this kind of light way, rather than thinking of beats in the way that we learn in elementary modern music, and to all kind of internalize that beat. I know it's not easy. It's not an easy task, but the rewards of something even as simple as reducing the number of beats we feel in the bar can have huge results.
Right. And that's part of the point of the Macaro approach to choronomy too, right? Although, again, totally separate subject.
Yes.
So one more question about these performance practice techniques. Of course, the classical Roman polyphonic sound is the source of the phrase a cappella. That is, in the chapel style, it is sung without instruments. Is there evidence to suggest that in chapels with less illustrious musical forces than, say, the Capella Julia, that there were instrumental reinforcements on parts? And as an extension of this question, do you think it's ever helpful to double vocal parts when parish choirs are singing classical polyphonic works?
There is ample evidence for instrumental doubling in the 16th century. And in particular, I would cite a couple authors who describe singing motets with reduced forces. So let's say that your alto doesn't show up on a particular Sunday morning. The organ has to sort of fill in. And this was, an important skill that an organist would have at that time. And so certainly doubling can be useful, especially I find with amateur musicians. It can give them they sing much better often while accompanied. The thing to watch out for is the phenomenon of what I call split second singing. So this is where a singer doesn't know how to read music well, and instead just sings by sort of responding to the instrumental accompaniment. That obviously is not the thing we're looking for, where the instrumental accompaniment becomes a crutch. But with someone who's confident with reading, the accompaniment can reinforce the sound, keep the ensemble in tune, and certainly is not ahistorical.
So a little bit of the nitty gritty of that, though. I mean, what are we looking at? If, let's say you're doing this on an organ, what sorts of stops are you talking about? Are you talking about flutes? Are you talking about principals? And also, how do you deal with the often experienced phenomenon that when you're singing right under the organ, you tend to hear it lower than it actually is?
Yeah, it's a real problem. I know. I think flutes are often not so successful, especially because of the hearing pitch problem. So, soft principals also seems to match, if you look at the specifications of Italian 16th century organs, it seems like that's probably what they were using.
Would they have been kind of chiffy on the front end and articulated in that way, or not?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. So what can students expect in your class this summer?
Well, I'm planning on covering each of the topics that we touched on today in depth. So spending a day each on ideas of tuning, pitch, range, tactus, tempo, conducting, all of those things. My main goal is to empower people who work with parish choirs to feel like they understand what current research shows us about how to approach music in this historical way, in a way that I think is going to be successful for them. So, singing things in the proper pitch and with what I think of as a more useful and freeing approach to rhythm can really add a lot to a parish program.
That's great. So will you have source readings? Are you going to focus on source readings, or are you going to focus more on summarizing the research and then experiencing it in context?
I think a little bit of both. So certainly there's no way to discuss tuning from a Renaissance perspective without just reading what people wrote about it at the time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. This has really been interesting and helpful. And I hope we'll see many of our listeners in your class this summer. I know that I will be sitting in on it in the evenings. And we're so grateful that you joined us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Always happy to be here.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.